Thank you for joining us this evening for the Religious Freedom Institute's Defender of Religious Freedom Award ceremony, which will honor Dr. Russell Moore, President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. We look forward to resuming our annual dinner for RFI's 2021 award, but we have embraced this year's virtual format as an opportunity to invite as many people as possible, including those who couldn't join us in person in Washington, D.C. We want all of you to hear from our two distinguished speakers, to learn about key RFI initiatives, and to acknowledge and celebrate with us the meaning and significance of religious freedom for our country and for the world. We're very grateful to Professor Robert George of Princeton University, who will serve as this evening's award presenter. Before we introduce Professor George, I want to turn your attention to a brief video that highlights the crisis of religious freedom in America today, what RFI is doing to address that crisis, and why we continue to have hope despite the enormous challenges and uncertainty we face in the months and years ahead. Before turning to our video, we would like to thank all those who made this evening's event possible. We want especially to acknowledge the generous support of our advocate sponsors, the Heritage Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, Ken and Alice Starr, Mary Ellen Bork, J. Patrick Kearns, financial advisor with Morgan Stanley, and Jerry and Germana Mitchell. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think you're going to like what you're about to see.
Religious freedom is a core human right that contributes to other societal goods. Tomorrow's leaders need to understand the essential and critical role that religious freedom plays in society.
I was raised in a foster home, and I always heard that through the welfare system that people get paid for taking care of you, and I always wondered whether they love me or not. I needed to know, what is my purpose? What is my peace? And it's through God that I was able to find out where my place, where I stand as a person.
I think it can be really hard in school to orient yourself towards a goal and a purpose. But it made me realize that God and the chance to live out your faith and seek your faith is everywhere. And I find that when I do remember that it is, all of the anxiety about the future and where I'll be after I graduate diminishes a lot.
There had been a murder in a field in southeast Washington, D.C. 9 young people had been shot and 4 of them had died. It was really tragic, but at that time, I was literally prompted by the Holy Spirit to start preaching there. And people began to come to Christ, and we actually ended up building a church. Project Eden came out of a vision that God had given me for an urban agricultural initiative or an urban garden. We've hired over 100 young people, and we do offer the food in the garden free of charge.
I think that the religious perspective, it shapes everything I do, because I think about my activities, my endeavors in terms of what I can do with the gifts He has given me. Now, unlike the way I grew up, Jews are less safe, even in America, than they were just a few short years ago. It's really important for us to take note of a turning against the Jews insofar as it represents not just a turning against Jews, but a turning against religion and against religious freedom.
I think religious freedom in America is under threat from the rise of secularism. Unfortunately, in our contemporary culture, many people want religion out of our public discourse.
There's been an increasing climate of silencing believers, silencing those whose views are not palatable to the popular culture.
We have an amnesia that has crept into many of our institutions, where there's this sense that, well, maybe religious freedom is just a subset of freedom of expression or freedom of association. And it's something that we can more or less dispense with.
Some of the things I worry about are healthcare, where people of faith should be free to follow their conscience. Another area that I have great concerns about is education. What we're seeing, particularly with the advance of gender ideology, is that the state is more than proposing, it's imposing.
The growth in anti-Semitic attacks, in anti-Semitic rhetoric that we're seeing is very grave.
Religious freedom is a crisis in the United States because we know historically that violent religious persecution occurs around the world and is preceded by invidious discrimination. And that's what's occurring in the United States against many religious communities.
We need to recognize that our human dignity is bound up with this desire to live out our most deeply held beliefs, not just for ourselves, but for the life of the world, for the life of our communities.
Faith is not just an individual thing. You know, we come together as believers and we create institutions. We have churches, but believers get together and they do something together. They create schools, they create hospitals, they create businesses that run according to their religious principles. And that's a gift for society.
The American genius has always been to bring religion into our public lives. We're in danger of losing that. RFI wants to recover the meaning and value of religious freedom in our country, which we fear is being lost amid some of the fierce battles that we're undergoing now.
The Medical Conscience Rights Initiative is a multi-year, multi-state project to protect the religious conscience of healthcare workers and healthcare institutions.
We are actually promoting a new initiative called the Brethren in the Faith Initiative, in which we hope to work with Christian leaders in particular to become champions in the fight against anti-Semitism.
Religious freedom is being ripped out of our classrooms. No one's teaching it. Our youth aren't learning about it. And so America's First Freedom curriculum was written to fill that gap.
RFI works all over the world. But in order to do that, the United States has got to protect religious freedom here at home. If we lose free exercise equality, not only will our beloved country suffer, but the entire world will suffer. At RFI, our mission to advance religious freedom for everyone, everywhere, must begin at home.
The Defender of Religious Freedom Award is an annual award given to a person making unparalleled contributions to defending religious freedom for everyone, everywhere, from within his or her faith tradition. Last year's award recipient was Archbishop Charles Chaput for his deep devotion to the advancement of religious liberty, both in his public and personal witness. This year, the award will be presented to Dr. Russell Moore, President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Moore is a brilliant, winsome, and tireless advocate for religious liberty. Whether making his case from the pulpit, via broadcast, or in the pages of the New York Times, Dr. Moore finds a way to speak so that others can listen. It is a great honor for us to present Dr. Moore with the 2020 Defender of Religious Freedom Award. Presenting this year's award is Robert P. George, a dear friend of RFI. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's also the former chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Professor George, thank you for being with us tonight.
Hello, friends. What a blessing it is for me to be part of this celebration of religious freedom and the work of the Religious Freedom Institute. Tom Farr and his team are heroes, standing up in very difficult circumstances for the great right, the great human right, the foundational human right to religious freedom, which is in jeopardy not only in our own country in so many ways, but across the globe. A right that is enjoyed by human persons properly, not in virtue of any of our particular achievements, our good looks, our intelligence, our athletic prowess, our charm, not in virtue of being a member of this religion or of embracing this ideology or that ideology, but simply in virtue of our humanity. A right that we have because the religious quest is so important to us as human beings. It's so intrinsic to our humanity. We would be less than truly fully human if we were not to be creatures who ask the fundamental questions of meaning and value. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What's ultimate? Is there a more than merely human source of meaning and value? What is to be known about human nature, human dignity, human destiny? Our humanity is bound up with those questions. Asking them makes us the persons that we are. Answering them authentically and being willing to live in line with our best judgments, those too are essential to our very humanity. But without freedom, none of that can happen. In circumstances of coercion, which exist in one measure or another for most people on the planet and have for most of history, in those circumstances, it becomes very difficult indeed, genuinely and sincerely, to seek the truth and to find the truth about what ultimately matters, about God, about our relationship to God. And so there can be no work more fundamental or important than the work of defending religious freedom. And I salute the Religious Freedom Institute for the very important contributions it makes to the cause of religious freedom. And what a joy it is, a special, special, special joy for me to be presenting on behalf of the Religious Freedom Institute today this award to Russell Moore as a great defender of religious freedom. There could be no person in the entire country more worthy of being honored for the defense of religious freedom than Dr. Moore. Russell is a dear old friend, so I'm going to refer to him as Russell, excuse my informality. But Russell's a hero of the religious freedom movement, and he's a hero because he has boldly stood up and spoken out, no matter the season, no matter the day, no matter the circumstances, boldly spoken out in favor of the religious freedom, in support of the religious liberty of all, not just of Baptists, not just of Christians, not just of Jews and Christians, not just of monotheists, not just of believers, but the religious freedom of all. And that religious freedom is a precious right of all. And yet, too often, people advocate religious freedom for me, but not for thee. But that's not Russell Moore. Russell, in the greatest traditions of Christian faith, advocates for the religious freedom of each and every member of the human family. The freedom which includes, of course, the freedom to believe, but also the freedom of the sincere unbeliever not to believe. Russell advocates on behalf of the person who is oppressed in Burma or in Korea or in Vietnam or in China or in Saudi Arabia or in Somalia or in the Sudan or in Cuba or in Venezuela. And he advocates on behalf of the person whose religious liberty is infringed here in the United States or in Belgium or in Germany or wherever it is. Whether it's a Jewish family denied the right to circumcise an infant male child, whether it is a Muslim family under pressure from the regime in Burma, in Myanmar, where the Rohingya Muslims are so brutally oppressed. Whether it's Tibetan Buddhists suffering the oppression of the Chinese government. Whether it is a baker or a wedding planner in the United States whose religious freedom is in jeopardy. Russell Moore is in the forefront of defending that individual's religious freedom. It doesn't matter whether that person shares Russell's own Christian convictions or his particular brand of Christian convictions. He's there precisely as a Christian, because of his Christian faith, to speak out and to stand up for anybody whose rights are in jeopardy. And so that's why the Religious Freedom Institute honors Russell today. And that's why I'm so honored myself to confer upon you, Russell, the Religious Freedom Institute's Defender of Religious Freedom Award 2020. God bless you, my dear brother.
Hello, I'm Russell Moore, and I'd like to start by saying how grateful I am to the Religious Freedom Institute for this honor. That it's especially meaningful to me, coming from an organization for which I have such respect and gratitude. Your president, Tom Farr, is one of my heroes in the world, not only in defending religious freedom, but in his leadership in every area as a man of character, and the entire RFI team the same. So let me thank you for this opportunity to be with you in this way. And also Robbie George, speaking from Princeton. It would have been such a delight if we could all have been together in Washington, but of course the current moment in pandemic prevents that. But it doesn't lessen at all the sense of camaraderie and fellowship that I have with all of you. One of the things that Robbie George and I often find ourselves talking about within minutes of seeing one another is our common love for country music and bluegrass music and other things. Robbie George is, of course, in the elite of the elites, as an Ivy League law professor cited all around the world, but he's also a West Virginian, and he understands and he knows country music. And so he will understand, even if no one else does, what I mean when I say that religious liberty causes me to think of a woman by the name of Loretta Lynn. Loretta Lynn, of course, was the coal miner's daughter who came to fame in the 1960s and 1970s as a country music songwriter and singer. And she found herself at one time in the White House under the presidency of Richard Nixon. And not knowing how to act in such rarefied settings, she put her hand out and shook the hands of the president and said, "How are you doing, Richard?" Afterwards, someone pulled her aside and said, "Miss Lynn, you cannot refer to the President of the United States by his first name of Richard." To which Loretta Lynn said, "Well, they called Jesus, Jesus, didn't they?" And I laugh when I think of that anecdote because on the one hand, of course, this singer was broaching protocol. On the other hand, her response shows something of the dynamic between the church and the state in terms of ultimacy. They called Jesus, Jesus. Her implication there is that there is something higher and greater than the state. And it seems to me that that's exactly what the task of preserving religious freedom is about at its core and at its nub. There are some people who, when we start talking about religious liberty, will say, well, I'm all for religious liberty, but we need not to be on the defensive, defending our liberty. We need to be on the offensive. The assumption behind that is the implication that what really matters is what the state does. And of course, what the state does matter immensely to our lives. What the culture does matter immensely to our lives. But what happens within those communities that are built around the transcendent, in my case, around Christian churches, is ultimately more important. So I come to you, a group of people from all sorts of different religions and commitments, but I am one who has been shaped and formed by the evangelical Christian movement, and specifically by the Baptist tradition. And someone who is the heir of people who went to prison, some of them even who went to their deaths, fleeing from state church in England into the Netherlands, and being willing to be jailed and imprisoned in the colonies, in the Massachusetts colony, and then in the early state of Virginia, because they advocated and believed in religious liberty, not just for themselves, but for everyone. And that message, it seems to me, is still pressing, maybe now more than ever. And there are a number of reasons why I think that is important from my tradition in a way that could benefit the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And there are several foundation stones there. The first is this: the nature of the gospel. Religious liberty and a church that is separate from the state in terms of responsibilities is, for me, fundamentally not just about natural rights, although it is. It's fundamentally not just about constitutional freedoms, although it is that. It's about my understanding of the gospel, the good news of how sinful people can be reconciled to God. And as someone who believes that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through Him, that means that there cannot be a state-coerced religion. That means that there cannot be a culturally coercive religion. And it also means that the state and the culture have no business restricting the free exercise of religious conscience and religious practice and religious belief. Because the way that people are ultimately transformed, in my view, is not through cultural pressure. It's not through the penalty of the law. It is through the new birth. And so fighting with Simon Peter's sword, as he did in the Garden of Gethsemane, is, as Jesus taught us, self-defeating. The sword that one uses will ultimately be used against that person, against that movement, against those people. And so an understanding of the gospel as coming through, as the Apostle Paul would put it, the open proclamation of the truth, rather than through coercion and rather than through restriction, is one of the reasons why I think the most evangelistic churches, not those who talk about evangelism most, but the ones who actually are the most evangelistic in reaching their neighbors with the gospel, also tend to be the ones who stand up for the freedom of their non-Christian neighbors. It's because they don't want to live in a world with pretend Christians. They want to offer to the world the really transformative power of the gospel itself. I also think what's significant and important is the freedom of the church, not confusing the kingdoms with one another. So as the Apostle Paul taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, what do I have to do with judging those who are on the outside? It is those who are on the inside that I judge. Both parts of that are significant and important for religious freedom. The church does not exercise coercive authority over the outside world. The church does not man the levers of government power, but nor does the state exercise headship and lordship over the church, over the composition of the church, over the practice of the church, over the church as governed by the lordship of her God. And so that means there are going to be issues where we, like Jesus with the temple tax, say we're simply going to accommodate something that we don't really think is necessary. But then there are going to be all sorts of other issues where what the state or the culture demand of us is to actually put our consciences in a blind trust, to put our obedience to God aside, which we cannot do. And in those cases, what we have to do is to say, we serve God rather than serve people, rather than serve governments, rather than serve states, rather than serve cultures, and we are willing to stand apart from that. That actually is long-term in the best interest of all people, because the worst thing that we can possibly have is a society where the herd or the sword or the state is ultimate. Only in a society where there is something greater than power, something greater than Caesar, something greater than the state, can one actually have a free society. And because of that, we start to understand what the nature of the conscience is, what the image of God in all people actually is, so that we seek to shape consciences. We don't seek to coerce consciences, and we don't allow our own consciences to be coerced. That's the reason why it's imperative for people who believe in religious freedom to stand up for the religious freedom of people with whom they disagree. There are many evangelical Protestants who don't agree with the Little Sisters of the Poor about their view of contraception, but who understand and know that a government that can force nuns to purchase what they believe to be life-destroying drugs is a government that's too powerful and too big. We do not have to agree with Jehovah's Witnesses about their views of the flag, or with the Amish about their views of the draft, in order to say a government that can force those people to do what they believe to be sin, which, as the Apostle Paul teaches us in Romans 14, anything that is not of faith is sin. That's a government that is too big. And so a commitment to religious freedom is a particular view of the human person. It's a particular view of the church, and it's also a particular view of the state, of the limits of authority, that a state does not have the competence to decide spiritual matters, because Caesar will not stand for the person at the judgment seat of Christ, nor does the church have the competence to rule the nations by the sword. These are two completely different designations. And so what that means is, as we advocate for religious liberty and for freedom of conscience, what we're ultimately seeking to do is to shape and form people both to stand apart as those who worship their God and as those who are able, with fully formed consciences, to serve in their various places of civic responsibility. And that means that ultimately the question is not just whether or not we will be persecuted. We should stand up for the freedoms that we have been given, not because we're seeking to protect ourselves, but because we're seeking to protect a heritage and an inheritance that will belong to other people. But also because the ultimate question is, as Isaac the Syrian said centuries ago, not just whether we will be persecuted, but whether we will be persecutors. We guard this heritage of religious freedom because we do not want centuries to come and generations to come to have their own consciences restricted because we did nothing when we were faced with the erosion of those liberties. So ultimately for me, as an evangelical Christian and as one in the Baptist tradition, ultimately for me, religious liberty is not just about courts, although it is that. It's not just about legislation, although it is that. It's not just about political philosophy, although it is that. Ultimately, religious liberty is rooted in the call to preach the gospel, to be the church, to seek the kingdom, to understand what it means to be good citizens who pledge allegiance where we should, but who always remember how to call Jesus, Jesus, who always remember that God is greater than Caesar. Thank you for this great honor. Thank you for our partnership together in this crucial work of religious freedom. I'm grateful and thankful.
I think religious freedom is the most significant value in our culture, and one that is under so much attack. And so anything I can do to support that is tremendously important. But why RFI particularly? Really, when you think about religious liberty and the challenges to religious freedom in our culture, there's so much that happens both upstream and downstream of actual litigation. Litigation gets the headlines, and litigation can be a game changer. But you've got to have that work that is sort of the heavy lifting that is throughout society. And that's where I see RFI. You know, it's in the majority of the arena where religion is being challenged, where people need to be educated about it, where it's being undervalued, where we need to build networks of believers, recognizing the common dignity of all. All those things are, again, upstream and downstream of litigation. And so I look to RFI to provide that voice, to clear the fog away and say, hey, let's focus on this and realize the challenge here, or realize the opportunity here to bring together believers or to bring forward a message of faith. And I think, you know, one thing the COVID crisis taught us was that it made visible sort of a fissure in society, a fracture that's been going on, I think, between religious believers and not. And the way that I think we saw that, or how that became visible during the COVID crisis, is that when churches were shut down, and I think as people of faith, everyone understood initially, it's like, okay, if this is what's needed, we want to keep people safe, that's fine. But the longer it went on, what I noticed was there was certainly a segment of society that sort of shrugged. It's like, who really cares whether those churches stay shut down? Because what value is religion anyway to society? I think it sort of surfaced the idea that there's a whole lot of people out there who need to understand what it is that religious faith and religious believers and religious institutions bring to a culture, even if they are not believers themselves, that there's so much there that is being given and that they're gaining, and that they need to value that. So that's where the work of RFI comes in. It's RFI that can help find the words to express that, to create the tools to educate people about that, to make the statements and bring the messages to the public square, to educate and speak to the influencers, the legislators, the policymakers, to help them understand and value religious freedom.
It's our distinct honor to be able to recognize Dr. Russell Moore this evening as an indispensable defender of religious freedom in our world today. Religious freedom is necessary for everyone on the face of the planet. Drawing on the traditional American understanding of its meaning and value, at RFI we call this free exercise equality. As our Declaration of Independence says, we are, each of us, created equal by God. There can be no greater driver of human equality than the conviction that this is true. The Religious Freedom Institute will continue to do the hard work of determining how, in different societies around the world, we can advance religious freedom on the ground. We will continue to develop the evidence of its value for the societies where we're working and provide that evidence to those in positions to bring about change. We recognize full well that this is a difficult task, but the stakes are very high for the victims of violent persecution around the world, for human dignity and human flourishing, for international stability, and for American national security. We at RFI are honored to be given this task and to pursue it in this great country in which we live. So here's the takeaway from this evening. If religious freedom is damaged or lost in America, where else can it be retrieved? The answer is nowhere. Those are the ultimate stakes. More than ever before, the work of preserving this precious right starts right here at home. Please join us as we defend religious freedom in this beloved country and for everyone, everywhere. Thank you for tuning in to the Religious Freedom Institute's 2020 Defender of Religious Freedom Award ceremony. May God bless you all.